In 1999, a derivatives analyst in Boston is handed a single sheet of paper by his boss. It shows the performance of a fund run by a well-known figure in New York, and the instruction is simple: build us a product that does the same thing. He looks at the numbers, and within a few hours he has concluded that he cannot build it, because nobody can, because the numbers on the page do not describe an investment strategy. They describe a line that goes up. He does not think it is improbable. He thinks it is impossible, in the way that a reported journey faster than light is impossible. So he writes it up and sends it to the Securities and Exchange Commission. That is in the year 2000. He sends it again in 2001. And in 2005, this time as a 21-page document with 29 specific red flags, under the title "The World's Largest Hedge Fund is a Fraud." And again in 2007. And again in 2008. For 9 years, nothing happens. Then, in December of 2008, two men walk into a federal office in Manhattan and report their own father. And Harry Markopolos, who had been correct for 9 years and had put it in writing 5 times, learns about it from the television. Welcome to this episode of The Great Cons. Every week on this channel, we take apart one great deception, tracing not just what the con artist did, but how it actually worked, why intelligent and cautious people believed it, and what it cost the ones who did. Some of these stories are about frauds so large they reshaped the law. Others are about small, strange, brilliant deceptions that fooled experts for decades. All of them share something. At some point, somebody trusted somebody else, and that trust was the raw material the whole thing was built from. We opened this series with Charles Ponzi, who ran his scheme for 8 months in 1920 and died in a charity ward with $75. At the end of that episode, one asked a question. If the mechanism has carried a warning label bearing a man's name for a century, if every financial regulator on earth knows exactly what it looks like, then how did a former chairman of the NASDAQ stock market run one for around 2 decades, from a Manhattan office, with audited statements, past regulators who examined him repeatedly? Today we answer it. And the answer turns out not to be about clever concealment at all. Because this is not a story about a fraud that nobody detected. It was detected. Repeatedly, in detail, in writing, by more than one person, and published in the financial press 7 years before it collapsed. It is a story about what happens when detection is not the problem. Let's start with who Bernard Madoff actually was, because the legitimacy was not a disguise. It was real. He was born in Queens, New York, in 1938, to a family of modest means. He founded Bernard L. Madoff Investment Securities in 1960, at the age of 22, with a few $1,000s saved from summer work. And the firm he built was a genuine and significant business. Madoff was an early and aggressive adopter of electronic trading at a time when the New York Stock Exchange floor was still dominant. His firm became one of the largest market makers in American equities, at times handling a substantial share of the daily volume in New York Stock Exchange listed stocks traded off the exchange. He was, in the strict sense, an innovator. His firm was among those whose technology fed into the development of the NASDAQ market, and he served as chairman of NASDAQ in the early 1990s. He sat on industry committees. He advised regulators. He was consulted on market structure. He was, by any measure, an establishment figure and a respected one. This matters enormously, and it is where most retellings go wrong. Madoff was not a hustler who talked his way into finance. He was a genuine market operator who had built a real and important firm over 30 years, and the fraud ran alongside it. The offices occupied several floors of a building on 3rd Avenue in Manhattan. The market-making business, the legitimate one, was on the 19th floor, modern, busy, open, staffed by traders including his 2 sons. The investment advisory business was on the 17th floor. That floor was different. It was quiet. Access was restricted. It was staffed by a small group of long-serving employees, and its operations were run by a man named Frank DiPasquale. who had joined the firm as a teenager and had no formal financial qualifications. And it ran on an old IBM computer, a machine already obsolete by the standards of the 1990s, kept deliberately isolated from the firm's modern systems. Its function was to produce customer statements, pages of trades, with dates, prices, and volumes, showing exactly the positions that would have produced the reported returns. The trades were selected after the fact, from historical price data, so that they would have been profitable. Then they were printed and posted. For a period that prosecutors and investigators have placed at somewhere in the region of 2 decades, and which Madoff at various points claimed was shorter, and which some investigators believe was longer, the 17th floor executed no trades at all. It is worth spending a moment on what actually happened on the 17th floor every day, because the mundanity of it is startling. According to testimony from the employees who were later prosecuted, and from Frank DePascali's own extensive cooperation with investigators, the work was clerical. Someone would decide what return a given account should show for the period. Historical market data would then be consulted, and trades would be selected retrospectively, choosing prices from days already past, at levels that would produce the desired result. Those trades were entered into the old computer system, which generated the statements and confirmations. Trade tickets and confirmations were printed on the correct stock. Testimony described efforts to make documents look properly aged and handled, so that paperwork supposedly generated months earlier did not arrive looking as though it had been printed that morning. Records were kept of which fictional positions each account supposedly held, because the fiction had to remain internally consistent. If an investor asked a question, the answer had to match what had been sent previously, and had to match what other investors had been sent. When regulators or auditors were expected, there was preparation. Employees have described assembling documents specifically for inspection and rehearsing what would be said. The scale of this is worth grasping. Thousands of accounts, each requiring a plausible statement, every month, for years, generated by a handful of people on obsolete equipment. There were no traders on that floor. There was no trading desk. There were no market data terminals of the kind a real operation of that size would require. There was a small group of long-serving staff producing paperwork. One of the most striking details from the aftermath is that the machine itself, the old computer that produced the statements, became an exhibit. The physical engine of one of the largest financial frauds in history was a piece of hardware that had been out of date for 15 years, sitting on a quiet floor, printing. Now the pitch, and here is the first genuinely clever thing. Madoff did not promise spectacular returns. Every instinct tells you that a fraud must offer something extraordinary, because extraordinary is what attracts money. Ponzi offered 50% in 45 days. Madoff offered something in the region of 10 to 12% a year. That is a good return. It is not an absurd one. Over the period in question, a decent equity fund might beat it in a strong year. It sits comfortably inside the range a sophisticated investor would consider plausible for a well-run strategy. But look at the second number, because the second number is where the lie lived. The returns were smooth. Month after month, year after year, in bull markets and crashes, through the 1987 crash, the 1998 crisis, the dot-com collapse, and September 11th, the line went up. Down months were rare and small. The variability of the returns was a fraction of what any real strategy holding equities would produce. That combination is the tell, and it is the single most useful thing in this episode. Not high returns. High returns are possible. Smooth returns are not. Real investing means being exposed to markets, and markets move violently and unpredictably. Any strategy that genuinely holds assets will have bad months, bad quarters, and occasionally a terrible year. A return stream that delivers roughly the same result regardless of what the world is doing is not describing exposure to anything. It is describing a number chosen by a person. The strategy he claimed to be running was called a split strike conversion, which is a real and unremarkable technique involving holding a basket of large stocks while using options to limit both the downside and the upside. It is a genuine strategy. It is used. It does not produce what Madoff reported, and it would have generated losses in certain conditions that his statements never showed. There is one question about this case that has never been satisfactorily answered, and it is worth stating plainly rather than pretending otherwise. Nobody knows when it started, or why. Madoff's own account, given at his plea and in subsequent interviews from prison, was that it began in the early 1990s. His version was that he had taken money from a number of institutional clients on the understanding that he would generate returns, that market conditions turned against him, and that rather than report losses he covered them, intending to trade his way out and repay everyone once conditions improved. It did not work, the hole grew, and by then he could not stop without exposing what he had already done. Investigators and the trustees' team came to a different view. Evidence assembled after the collapse pointed much further back, to the 1970s or early 80s, and some victims produced statements from decades earlier showing the same impossible pattern. Employees who were prosecuted described practices that predated Madoff's stated start date by many years. His stated timeline was also convenient in a specific way. An earlier start date implicates more people and more years of activity, and pushes the beginning of the conspiracy back into a period when others in the firm would have had to know. As to why, his own explanations shifted. At various times he described being under pressure from clients he could not refuse, being trapped by his own reputation, and being unable to bring himself to admit failure. He also, in some interviews, displayed something closer to grievance than remorse, describing the banks and funds that fed him money as having been willfully incurious, which is true, and using it as though it diminished his own responsibility, which it does not. There is a version of this story in which a real trader takes a real loss and makes one catastrophic decision to hide it, and then spends 30 years unable to escape the consequence. That version is not impossible, and something like it has happened in other cases. But it does not explain the scale, the duration, the deliberate architecture of a separate floor with a separate system, or the fact that he continued to accept new money from new investors within weeks of the end, when he knew with certainty that it would be gone. Now, the marketing, and this is the second clever thing, because it is an inversion. Madoff did not sell. He was hard to get into. You could not simply invest. You needed an introduction. And having been introduced, you might be refused. Madoff turned people away, sometimes wealthy and prominent people, and he did it in a manner that suggested he was doing them the courtesy of an honest explanation. The effect of that is not subtle, and anyone who has ever wanted into an exclusive club will recognize it. Scarcity converts a proposition into a privilege. A person who has been refused and then later accepted does not perform due diligence on the thing they have just been granted. They feel they have won something. The networks he moved through were tight and wealthy. Country clubs in Palm Beach and on Long Island. Jewish philanthropic and communal circles in New York and Florida, in which Madoff was a prominent and generous figure. Word traveled through personal recommendation among people who trusted each other. This is affinity fraud, the same mechanism we identified in the Ponzi episode operating in Boston's Italian community, running here at the top of American wealth. The community is different. The mechanism is identical. Trust that already exists between members is borrowed by the fraud. And then there were the feeders, which is how a scheme becomes enormous. Feeder funds were investment funds whose primary or sole business was to gather money from clients and place it with Madoff. Fairfield Greenwich Group was the largest, run by Walter Noel, and it channeled billions. There were others in New York, and significant channels in Europe through banks and funds in Switzerland, Austria, Spain, and France. These funds charged their clients management and performance fees for the service of allocating money to Madoff. Consider that arrangement, because it explains a great deal. A feeder fund's revenue depended on the assets it placed. Its principals became extremely wealthy, and their entire business would evaporate the moment they concluded that Madoff was not real. That is not a situation in which people investigate rigorously. It is a situation in which people conduct enough due diligence to be able to say they conducted due diligence. Some funds did press. Some asked for verification, for electronic access, for the identity of the counterparties. Madoff refused, generally on the grounds of protecting his proprietary strategy, and sometimes by suggesting that an investor who did not trust him should take their money elsewhere. Almost nobody took the money elsewhere. Now let's go through what anyone could have seen, because this is not a case of subtle concealment. Red flag 1, the smoothness of the returns, which we have covered, and which was visible to anyone with the monthly numbers and a spreadsheet. Red flag 2, the auditor. A firm managing what was reported as tens of billions of dollars was audited by Freeling and Horowitz, a practice operating from a small office in a suburban strip mall in New City, New York. It had 3 employees, David Freeling, a secretary, and a partner in his late 70s who lived in Florida. An accounting practice of that size cannot audit an operation of that scale. It is not a question of competence. It is arithmetic. Freeling later pleaded guilty to charges relating to his conduct and admitted he had not conducted meaningful audits. Red flag 3, and this is the structural one. Madoff was his own custodian. In normal practice, these functions are separated. An investment manager makes decisions. A separate custodian bank holds the assets. A separate administrator calculates the value. A separate auditor checks. That separation exists precisely so that no single party can simply state what the assets are. Madoff was the manager, the broker, the custodian, and the administrator. Every number came from him. Nothing was independently verifiable, because there was no independent party in the chain. Red flag 4, the statements arrived on paper, by post, with no real-time electronic access to positions. In the 2000s, for an operation of that size, that is extraordinary. Paper statements arriving after the fact cannot be checked against a live market. Red flag 5, the options problem. The strategy Madoff claimed required buying and selling options on major indices in volumes proportionate to the assets under management. Analysts who did the arithmetic found that the required volume exceeded the total open interest in those options in the entire market. There were not enough contracts in existence for him to have been doing what he said. Red flag 6, secrecy. Investors were discouraged from discussing the arrangement. Feeder funds sometimes avoided naming Madoff in their documents. And red flag 7, which is quiet but damning, several major institutions did look properly, concluded something was wrong, and simply declined to invest. Some large banks and consultancies put Madoff on internal do not recommend lists. They did not report him. They just walked away and said nothing publicly, which is a professional norm worth thinking about. That norm deserves a moment, because it recurs across this entire series. The institutions that declined had done real work. Their analysts had asked the right questions, received unsatisfactory answers, and reached the correct conclusion, in some cases years before the collapse. Having done so, they wrote an internal memo, declined the allocation, and moved on. There are reasons that are not disreputable. A firm that publicly accuses a prominent regulated entity of fraud, on the basis of an internal analysis, exposes itself to litigation it may not win. Regulators exist to make such accusations, and the reasonable assumption is that raising it is their job. But the effect is a system in which the best resourced participants, the ones most likely to detect a fraud, are also the ones with the strongest incentive to keep quiet about it once they have. They protect themselves and their own clients, and they leave everyone else exposed. There were also individual investors who got out, and their accounts are instructive. Some withdrew because a detail bothered them, the paper statements, the refusal to permit an independent auditor, an answer that did not quite make sense. Almost all of them described the same experience afterwards, which is that friends and family thought they were being foolish, and that they endured years of watching people they knew earn steady returns while they had walked away from the best investment available. Being right early is socially expensive, which is why so few people manage it. The person who withdrew in 2002 spent 6 years looking like the one who did not understand. Which brings us to Harry Markopolos. In 1999, Markopolos was working at Rampart Investment Management in Boston, a firm that traded derivatives. A colleague, Frank Casey, had encountered a fund whose returns clients kept asking Rampart to match. Markopolos' manager asked him to reverse engineer it. He looked at the reported performance, and the objection that came to him first was not a suspicion. It was a mathematical observation. Markopolos has described running the correlation between the reported returns and the market they were supposedly derived from. The relationship was not what the claimed strategy would produce. He has described the shape of the return stream as being like a baseball player batting .966 for a season, not merely excellent, but outside the range of what the game permits. Two possibilities existed. Either Madoff was front-running his own market-making order flow, using knowledge of incoming customer orders to trade ahead of them, which is illegal but at least describes something real. Or there were no trades at all, and it was a Ponzi scheme. Markopolos assembled a small informal team, Frank Casey, an analyst named Neil Cello, and a financial journalist named Michael Okrent. Over years they gathered feeder fund documents, traced the flows, interviewed people, and built the case. In May 2000, Markopolos submitted his analysis to the Boston office of the SEC. He submitted a revised version in March 2001. In 2005 he submitted the document that has become famous. The world's largest hedge fund is a fraud, 21 pages, setting out 29 red flags, stating explicitly that this was probably a Ponzi scheme, and estimating the size in the range of tens of billions of dollars. He submitted further material in 2007 and in 2008. And this is the part that people find hardest to believe: it was also published. In May 2001, Michael Okrent published a piece in a hedge fund trade publication questioning how the returns were achieved. In the same month, Aaron Arvid-Lund published an article in Barron's, a major and widely read financial magazine, under a title asking why Madoff would not explain his method, laying out the skepticism among professionals and noting that he declined to explain the strategy. That was in a mainstream financial publication, in 2001, 7 years before the collapse. Nothing happened. Markopolos, meanwhile, had become frightened. He has stated publicly and testified that he believed that if Madoff or those around him discovered what he was doing, he might be killed. He has described taking precautions, checking his car, and carrying a weapon. He was also concerned that if he approached the SEC in New York rather than Boston, his submission might reach people connected to Madoff. Whether or not the danger was real, the fear was, and it shaped his behavior for years. So why did nothing happen? This is the heart of the episode. In 2009, after the collapse, the Inspector General of the SEC, David Kotz, produced a report on the agency's handling of the matter. It runs to hundreds of pages and it is one of the most damning documents any regulator has published about itself. Its findings, in summary: the SEC received 6 substantive complaints about Madoff over roughly 16 years. It conducted multiple examinations and investigations. Every single one was conducted incompetently, and none of them uncovered the fraud, despite the fact that confirming it required a single, obvious step that was never taken. The specifics are worse than the summary. Examinations were assigned to junior staff with limited relevant experience. Some had never conducted an examination of this kind before. They did not understand the strategy they were supposedly investigating. Madoff managed them personally, and he managed them the way a con man manages anyone, with status. He talked about his role at NASDAQ, his work with regulators, his standing in the industry, and on at least one occasion, according to the report, mentioned that he was on a short list for a senior regulatory position. Investigators who were far junior to him in reputation were interviewing a man who had helped design the market they regulated. Examinations focused on the wrong questions. One investigation looked at front-running rather than at whether the assets existed at all. And here is the single fact that defines the whole failure. Madoff claimed to hold securities. Securities in the American market are held through a central clearing organization, the Depository Trust and Clearing Corporation, and the SEC could have asked that organization, directly, whether the positions Madoff reported actually existed. It would have taken one request. The answer would have been no, immediately and unambiguously. In 2006, during an investigation, Madoff was asked for and provided his account number at that clearing organization. Nobody checked it. Madoff himself later described that moment as the point at which he believed he had been caught, and expressed astonishment that the check was never made. The Inspector General's report examined whether corruption explained any of this and did not find evidence of it. What it found was a failure of competence, of supervision, of institutional memory, and of nerve. There was one further complication in the appearances. An SEC official who had worked on a Madoff-related examination later married Madoff's niece, who worked as the firm's compliance lawyer. The Inspector General examined that relationship specifically and did not find that it had improperly influenced any decision. But it illustrated how closely intertwined the regulators and the regulated had become. Now let's talk about how it ended, which was not through investigation. Through 2008, the global financial system convulsed. Credit markets froze, banks failed, and investors everywhere needed cash, either because they faced their own losses or because they were meeting redemptions from their own clients. A Ponzi scheme cannot survive that, for the reason we established in the first episode of this series. It has no assets to sell. It can only pay for money coming in, and in a panic, money stops coming in and starts going out. By late 2008, requests to withdraw had reached billions of dollars, and Madoff could not meet them. On the 10th of December 2008, he told his sons Mark and Andrew, who worked in the legitimate trading business on the 19th floor, that the advisory business was, in his own reported words, one big lie. He told them he intended to distribute several $100 million in remaining funds to family and employees. His sons contacted a lawyer that night, and the lawyer contacted the authorities. The following morning, FBI agents came to his apartment. Asked whether there was an innocent explanation, Madoff said there was not. He was arrested on the 11th of December 2008. In March 2009, he pleaded guilty to 11 federal charges. He entered no plea bargain and named no accomplices at that stage. In June 2009, he was sentenced to 150 years, the maximum available. The judge described the crimes as extraordinarily evil and specifically rejected the argument for a lighter sentence on the grounds that a symbolic sentence mattered. He died in federal prison in April 2021, aged 82. Now, the numbers, because the famous figure is widely misunderstood and the truth is more interesting. The $65 billion figure that appeared in every headline was the total shown on customer statements at the end, the sum of everything investors believed they had, including decades of fictitious profits. That money never existed. It was a number produced by a printer. The actual cash that investors put in and did not get back, the principal loss, has been assessed at somewhere in the region of $17.5 billion. That is the real whole, and it is still one of the largest financial frauds ever committed. And here is the part almost nobody knows. The trustee appointed to recover assets, a lawyer named Irving Picard, pursued recovery for well over a decade, and he pursued it aggressively, and in a way that made him widely disliked. His central tactic was the clawback, suing investors who had withdrawn more than they put in. That is a brutal thing to do to people who believed they were withdrawing their own legitimate gains, and many of those sued were not wealthy. But the legal logic is sound and it follows directly from what a Ponzi scheme is. Money withdrawn as profit was not profit. It was another investor's principle. Allowing early withdrawers to keep it means later investors bear the entire loss. Through litigation and settlements, including major settlements with feeder funds and banks, the recovery reached a remarkable level. Well over $14 billion of the roughly $17.5 billion in principal has been recovered and distributed, a recovery rate in the region of 80%. For a fraud of this kind, that is close to unprecedented. Ponzi's investors got 30 cents on the dollar. Most fraud victims get nothing. The clawback deserves one more sentence, though, because it created a category of victim that people rarely think about. Consider someone who invested with Madoff in 1990, drew a modest income from the account for 18 years to live on in retirement, and never took out more in total than they believed they were earning. Under the trustees' logic, if their withdrawals exceeded what they originally deposited, they owed money back, regardless of the fact that they had spent it decades earlier on ordinary life. Some of those people had already lost their remaining balance in the collapse. They then received a demand for the money they had withdrawn. A number were elderly and had no capacity to repay anything. The courts largely upheld the trustees' approach, because the alternative is worse. Allowing early investors to keep other people's principal means later investors absorb the entire loss. There is no version of unwinding a Ponzi scheme in which everybody is treated fairly, because the money to treat everybody fairly does not exist and never did. Every possible allocation is a choice about which victims bear the shortfall. That is a fact about all frauds of this kind, and it is one more reason the collapse of a Ponzi scheme keeps producing casualties for years after the criminal has been sentenced. But recovery of money is not recovery of everything, and the human cost was severe. Charitable foundations were destroyed. Organizations that had placed endowments with Madoff lost them outright, and several closed permanently. A number of Jewish charities and educational institutions, which had come to him through the communal networks in which he was trusted, were badly damaged. Universities lost endowment funds. Individual retirees lost everything they had, in some cases in their 80s, with no prospect of earning again. In December 2008, within weeks of the arrest, Thierry de la Villehouchet, a French financier who had placed his own money and that of clients and friends with Madoff, took his own life in his New York office. 2 years later, almost exactly 2 years to the day after he reported his father, Mark Madoff took his own life. Andrew Madoff, the other son who made that call, died of cancer in 2014. Neither son was ever charged with any offense, and investigators concluded they had not known. Frank Di Pasquale, who had run the 17th floor, cooperated extensively with prosecutors and died in 2015 before he could be sentenced. 5 other employees were convicted at trial in 2014. The auditor pleaded guilty. Ruth Madoff surrendered the overwhelming majority of her assets under a settlement, and lived thereafter in greatly reduced circumstances. What changed afterwards? More than people assume, actually. The custody rules were tightened, making it considerably harder for an advisor to hold client assets without independent verification. Requirements around independent auditing and surprise examinations were strengthened. The SEC restructured how it handles tips and complaints, having discovered that it had no functioning system for ensuring that a serious, detailed, repeated complaint from a credentialed professional reached anyone competent to act on it. And in 2010, the Dodd-Frank legislation created a formal whistleblower program, with an office to receive reports and financial awards for information leading to successful enforcement. That program has since produced very large numbers of tips and substantial recoveries. That last reform is, in a sense, the Markopolos Memorial. The system now has a door specifically designed so that the next person with a spreadsheet and a correct answer does not have to spend 9 years shouting through a wall. So what is the lesson, and how does it connect to everything else in this series? Go back to the 4 warning signs we identified in the Ponzi episode. Returns too high and too smooth, present, and in this case the smoothness alone was conclusive. A mechanism the investor cannot verify, present, made absolute by the fact that Madoff was his own custodian. Social proof doing the selling, present, running through country clubs and communal networks. Growth or death, present, and it is what killed him in 2008. All 4 were there. Nothing new was invented. But this episode adds one more, and it is the one we identified in the Abagnale episode: institutional laundering. Everyone in this story was relying on somebody else's verification, and nobody was performing any. Individual investors relied on the feeder funds. The feeder funds relied on the fact that Madoff was a regulated entity with an audited history and a chairmanship of NASDAQ behind him. Investors and funds both relied on the fact that the SEC had examined him. And the SEC's examiners, junior and out of their depth, relied on the fact that the man in front of them was a pillar of the industry who had helped build the market. Madoff was, at various times, able to tell prospective investors that he had been examined by the regulator, and no problems had been found. Which was true. The examination itself, the thing that should have destroyed him, became a selling point. Every link in the chain treated the previous link as the verification. There was no verification anywhere in the chain. And that, finally, is why this story is worth 40 minutes of anybody's time. We tell ourselves that frauds succeed because they are hidden. This one was not hidden. A working analyst identified it in an afternoon, in 1999. A national financial magazine published skeptical questions about it in 2001. Detailed written submissions reached the regulator 5 times. Major institutions examined it, concluded it was not real, and declined to invest. The information was available. It was correct. It was in the hands of the people whose job it was to act on it. Harry Markopoulos, testifying to a congressional committee after the collapse, said that the agency had roared like a mouse and fought like a flea. He also said something less quoted and more useful, that the SEC staff simply did not understand the products they were regulating, and that no amount of good intention substitutes for competence. The next great fraud will probably not be concealed either. Somebody will notice. Somebody will write it down. The question, as it was for 9 years in this case, is whether the document gets read by anyone capable of understanding it, and whether that person is willing to act against someone important. Next time on The Great Cons, we go from the top of American finance to the top of Manhattan society, and to a young woman who arrived with almost no money and convinced hotels, banks, lawyers, and a great many wealthy people that she was a German heiress with a fortune held up in Europe. She did it with an enormous amount of confidence, a very small amount of cash, and one crucial insight, that people at the top of society are extremely reluctant to admit that they do not recognize someone. If this was worth your time, please give it a like, and subscribe so you don't miss it. And leave a comment below telling us which con we should take apart after that. Thank you for watching.